It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you feel happy and lazy all at once. The sky was big and blue, not a single cloud in sight, and the sun was shining so bright it felt like summer even if it wasn't. Birds chirped in the trees, hopping from branch to branch, and a soft breeze moved the leaves just a little. Down the street, kids were laughing, maybe playing tag or riding bikes. Everything seemed perfect, calm, peaceful, and just right. And Jake Miller? He was loving it. Jake was a regular guy who lived in a small house on Maple Street. It wasn't a fancy house, but it was his, and he liked it that way. It had a little porch out front where he could sit and watch the world go by, and a driveway where he parked his car. Jake wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't cause trouble or make a fuss. He was the kind of guy who said hi to everyone, helped you carry groceries if your bags were too heavy, and always had a smile. People liked Jake because he was nice and easy to talk to. But today? Today was about to get a little crazy for him, and he didn't even know it yet. See, Jake had this plan for his Tuesday. It wasn't a big plan, just a simple one. He wanted to stay home, relax, and enjoy the quiet. Maybe he'd read a book, or watch some TV, or just sit outside and listen to the birds. He didn't have to go to work, and there were no errands to run. It was his day to do whatever he wanted, and what he wanted was peace. So, he grabbed a tall glass of lemonade, nice and cold with ice cubes clinking against the sides, and headed out to his porch. He plopped down in his favorite chair, the one with the soft cushion, and took a big sip. The lemonade was sweet and sour, just how he liked it, and it made him smile. This, he thought, is a perfect day. But before we go any further, let's talk about Jake's car. It wasn't a fancy car, no shiny red sports car or big truck with giant wheels. It was just a regular blue car, the kind you see everywhere. It got him to the store, to his job, and back home again without any trouble. Jake took good care of it, washing it when it got dirty and making sure it ran smoothly. And on this sunny day, he'd parked it right in his driveway, same as always. Nothing special about that, right? Well, there was one little thing, the sunshades. Jake had these shiny silver sunshades he put up in the car windows. They weren't anything crazy, just big pieces of stuff that looked a little like foil, the kind you use to wrap leftovers. He popped them into the front and side windows to keep the sun out. Why? Because the sun was hot. It could turn his car into an oven, making the seats burn your legs when you sat down and the steering wheel too hot to touch. Jake didn't like that, so he used the shades. They worked great, and he'd been doing it forever. To him, it was no big deal. Just a smart idea on a sunny day. He didn't think anyone would care. But someone did care. Someone cared a lot. Across the street from Jake's house lived Karen Thompson. Now, Karen wasn't like Jake. She wasn't the say hi and smile type. Oh no. Karen was the kind of person who thought she was the boss of everyone. She lived in a house with perfect grass, perfect flowers, and a perfect little sign out front that said Thompson family. Everything about her house screamed, "Look at me." Karen liked rules. She liked them so much she made sure everyone else followed them too, even if they didn't want to. She was part of something called the HOA, short for Homeowners Association. It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like no loud music or paint your house this color. Jake didn't mind the HOA most of the time. He followed the big rules, like keeping his trash cans out of sight. But Karen? She took it way too far. Karen called herself the neighborhood queen. Not out loud, of course she wasn't that silly, but you could tell she thought it. She walked around with her nose up, like she was better than everyone else. If your grass grew too long, Karen would knock on your door with a frown. If your dog barked once, she'd write you a note. If you hung a Halloween decoration she didn't like, she'd tell you to take it down. Everyone on Maple Street knew Karen, and most of them rolled their eyes when her name came up. "Here comes Karen again," they'd whisper. But Jake? He didn't pay her much attention. He figured if he stayed quiet and didn't bother anyone, she'd leave him alone. Boy, was he wrong about that. On this sunny Tuesday, Karen was standing at her window, peeking out from behind her fancy white curtains. She had a cup of tea in her hand, and her eyes were sharp, like a hawk looking for something to swoop down on. She liked watching the street, it made her feel important. And that's when she saw it, Jake's car. Sitting there in his driveway, all normal and boring, except for those sunshades. To you or me, they'd just be sunshades. No problem, right? But to Karen, they were trouble. Big trouble. See, Karen had this rulebook in her head. It wasn't the real HOA rulebook. Most of those rules were simple, like don't park on the grass. No, Karen's rulebook was her own special version, full of things she decided were wrong. And one of those things. Sunshades. She didn't like how they looked. They were too shiny, too weird, too different. To her, they made Jake's car look messy, and messy was against her rules. She didn't care that they kept the car cool or that Jake had every right to put them up. All she saw was something she didn't like, and that was enough. Karen put her tea down on the table clink, and narrowed her eyes. She stared at Jake's car like it had just insulted her. Those sunshades, she muttered to herself, are an eyesore. They're ruining the neighborhood. Now, let's be real, the neighborhood looked fine. The houses were neat, the flowers were blooming, and Jake's car wasn't hurting anyone. But Karen didn't see it that way. She saw a battle she was going to win. She didn't know it yet, but this little fight she was picking? It was about to turn into something way bigger than she could handle. Jake, meanwhile, was still on his porch, sipping his lemonade. He had no idea Karen was glaring at his car like it was a monster. He was just enjoying the sun, the breeze, and the quiet. Every now and then, he'd look out at the street and wave at a neighbor walking by. "Hey, Mrs. Carter," he'd call to the old lady with her little dog. She'd wave back and smile. Jake liked that simple, friendly moments. He didn't know that across the street, Karen was already planning her next move. And oh boy, was it a move. Karen grabbed her phone off the kitchen counter. It was one of those big, fancy phones with a sparkly case, because of course it was. She didn't even sit down. She stood there, tapping her foot, her mind racing. "This can't stand," she said to herself. "I'm not letting Jake get away with this." Get away with what? Sunshades. Yep, that's all it was. But to Karen, it was like Jake had painted his house purple or set off fireworks in the middle of the day. She was mad, and when Karen got mad, she didn't just sit there. She did something. Now, most people, if they didn't like something, might just shrug and move on. Maybe they'd talk to their friends about it or grumble a little. Not Karen. She wasn't the shrugging type. She was the make a big deal out of nothing type. And what she decided to do next? It was wild. She didn't just knock on Jake's door to talk. She didn't write him a note or call a meeting. No, Karen went straight to the top, or at least, what she thought was the top. She decided to call the police. Yep, you heard that right, the police. Over sunshades. Jake didn't know it yet, but his quiet day was about to get loud. He was still sitting there, his lemonade half gone, the ice melting into little puddles in the glass. The sun was still shining, the birds were still singing, and everything felt normal. But across the street, Karen was dialing 911, her finger shaking with excitement. She thought she was about to win, to show Jake who was boss. She thought those sunshades were her ticket to proving she ran this neighborhood. But here's the thing, Karen didn't see the whole picture. She didn't know something big was already happening, something that would flip this whole story upside down. See, Jake wasn't just a guy with a car and some sunshades. He was smart. He noticed things. And lately, he'd noticed something weird about Karen's house. Strange cars pulling up at night. Packages piling up by her door. Little things that didn't add up. He hadn't said anything yet. He wasn't the type to gossip, but he'd been watching. And he'd made a quiet call of his own a few days ago, not to 911, but to the police station. He didn't make a fuss about it, just dropped a tip. "Hey," he'd said, "you might want to check out what's going on over there." He didn't know if they'd listen, but he figured it was worth a shot. So while Karen was busy staring at his sunshades, thinking she had the upper hand, Jake was sitting pretty with a secret. A big one. Karen thought she was about to ruin his day, but she didn't realize her own day was about to fall apart. Those sunshades? They were just the beginning. The real story, the one that would make your jaw drop, was coming, and it was coming fast. So, what do you think Karen's about to do? Call the cops and yell about Jake's car? Oh, she's going to try. But stick around, because this story's about to get good. You won't believe what happens next, not in a million years. Jake's quiet Tuesday is about to turn into the wildest day on Maple Street, and Karen? She's in for the surprise of her life. Ready? Let's keep going. Karen Thompson wasn't the kind of person who let things go. Nope, not even a little bit. If something bugged her, she didn't just sit there and grumble quietly like most people might. She didn't sip her tea and forget about it. Oh no, Karen was the type to do something, and usually, that something was loud and bossy. She liked being in charge, and she liked everyone knowing it. So when she saw Jake Miller's car sitting in his driveway with those shiny sunshades in the windows, it wasn't just a tiny annoyance to her. It was like a giant red flag waving in her face, screaming, "Fix me." And Karen? She was ready to fix it, whether Jake liked it or not. It all started right after she spotted those sunshades from her window. She'd been standing there, peeking out through her fancy white curtains, her tea getting cold on the table. Her eyes locked onto Jake's car like a hawk spotting a mouse. To her, those silver sunshades weren't just keeping the heat out, they were breaking her rules. Not the real neighborhood rules, mind you, but Karen's rules. She had this idea in her head that everything on Maple Street had to look perfect, and those shiny shades, they didn't fit her picture of perfect. They were too bright, too weird, too different. And Karen didn't like different. She liked things her way, and her way only. So what did she do? Did she take a deep breath and let it go? Did she think, oh well, it's just a car? Nope. Karen grabbed her phone off the counter, her big, fancy phone with the sparkly pink case, and she made up her mind right then and there. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not today, not ever. She straightened her shoulders, puffed out her chest like she was about to march into battle, and stormed out her front door. Her slippers slapped against the pavement as she crossed the street, her phone clutched tight in one hand. She was on a mission, and that mission was to tell Jake exactly what she thought of his sunshades. Jake, meanwhile, was still inside his house, totally clueless about the storm heading his way. He'd been out on his porch earlier, sipping his lemonade and enjoying the sunny day. The ice in his glass had melted a little, leaving tiny drops of water on the table next to his chair. He'd waved at a neighbor, smiled at the birds chirping in the trees, and then decided to head inside for a bit. Maybe he'd grab a snack or flip on the TV, nothing big, just a lazy Tuesday plan. His car was still parked in the driveway, those sunshades doing their job, keeping the seats cool. To Jake, everything was fine. Normal. Peaceful. He had no idea Karen was about to turn his quiet day into a big, loud mess. Karen didn't knock on Jake's door like a normal person might. She didn't ring the bell or wait politely. Oh no, that wasn't her style. Instead, she marched right up to his front yard, stopped in front of his car, and started yelling. "Those sunshades are an eyesore," she shouted, her voice booming so loud it bounced off the houses nearby. "They're ugly, and they don't belong here." She pointed at the car like it had just insulted her whole family. Her face was red, her eyes were wide, and she was waving her phone around like it was a magic wand that could make Jake's car disappear. The whole block could hear her. Down the street, Mrs. Carter, who was walking her little dog, Tinker, stopped and turned to look. A kid on a bike slowed down, his head tilted, wondering what the fuss was about. Even the birds seemed to quiet down for a second, like they were listening too. Karen didn't care who heard her. In fact, she wanted them to hear. She wanted everyone to know she was mad, and she wanted Jake to feel it. "You're breaking the rules," she yelled again, stomping her foot on the grass. "And I'm calling the cops." Inside his house, Jake heard the commotion. He was in the kitchen, pouring himself another glass of lemonade, when Karen's voice cut through the air like a siren. He frowned, confused, and set the pitcher down on the counter. "What's she yelling about?" he muttered to himself. He walked over to the window by the front door and peeked out, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. There was Karen, standing in his yard, pointing at his car and shouting like she'd lost her mind. Jake blinked. He tilted his head. "The sunshades," he said out loud, scratching his chin. "She's mad about the sunshades." Now, if Jake were someone else, he might have gotten mad right back. He might have stormed outside and yelled at Karen to leave him alone. But Jake wasn't that guy. He was calm, easygoing, the kind of person who didn't let little things get under his skin. So instead of getting upset, he opened his front door and stepped onto the porch. "Hey, Karen," he called out, his voice nice and steady. What's the problem? Karen spun around to face him, her eyes narrowing like she was a cat about to pounce. The problem, she snapped. The problem is those. She jabbed her finger at the car again, her nail polish flashing in the sunlight. Those stupid sunshades. They're against the rules, Jake. You can't just put junk like that in your windows and ruin the neighborhood. She crossed her arms, her phone still in her hand, and glared at him like he'd committed a terrible crime. Jake looked at his car, then back at Karen. He was still confused, but he tried to explain. They're just sunshades, Karen, he said, keeping his voice friendly. They keep the car cool. It's hot out today, you know. They're not hurting anything. He shrugged a little, hoping she'd see it wasn't a big deal. To him, it made sense sunshades weren't a neon sign or a pile of trash. They were just a simple thing to make his day better. Why was she so worked up? But Karen wasn't having it. Not even a little bit. She didn't care about Jake's explanation. She didn't want to hear it. To her, those sunshades were a personal attack, like Jake had put them up just to make her mad. Don't you talk back to me, she barked, shaking her head so fast her hair bounced. I know the rules, and you don't. The HOA says we keep things neat around here, and those shades are not neat. She pulled out a little booklet from her pocket, a rule book she carried everywhere like it was her best friend, and waved it in the air. It's right here in black and white, she said, even though she didn't open it to show him. She just held it up like it was proof she was right. Jake squinted at the rule book, then at Karen. He wasn't sure the HOA even had a rule about sunshades. He'd lived on Maple Street for years, and he'd never heard of it. The real rules were simple stuff like no parking on the lawn or keeping your trash cans hidden. Sunshades didn't seem like they'd be in there. But he didn't argue. He just stood there on his porch, hands in his pockets, watching Karen wave her book around. Okay, he said slowly, but I don't think the cops are gonna care about this. That was the wrong thing to say. Oh boy, was it the wrong thing? Karen's face turned even redder, like a tomato about to pop. The cops, she shouted. Oh, they'll care when I tell them. You think you can break the rules and get away with it? Not on my street. She held up her phone and started tapping the screen, her fingers moving fast. I'm calling them right now, Jake. You'll see. They'll come and make you take those ugly things down. She was so mad she was practically dancing in place, her slippers sliding on the grass. Jake watched her, still calm as ever. He didn't yell back. He didn't stomp his feet or call her names. He just shrugged again, a little smile tugging at his lips. All right, Karen, he said. You do what you gotta do. Then he turned around and walked back inside his house, closing the door behind him. He wasn't scared of her threats. Not one bit. Why? Well, Jake had a little secret, something Karen didn't know about. Something that was going to make this whole thing a lot more interesting than she expected. See, Karen thought she was the boss. She thought she could march over, yell at Jake, and call the cops, and that would be the end of it. She thought she'd win, just like she always did when she bossed people around. If someone's grass was too long, she'd nag until they mowed it. If a kid left a toy in the yard, she'd complain until it was gone. Karen was used to getting her way, and she loved it. It made her feel big, important, like the queen of Maple Street. And right now, she was sure she had Jake right where she wanted him. She thought he was just a quiet guy who'd back down and do what she said. She thought she was in charge. But here's the thing, Karen didn't know everything. She didn't know Jake as well as she thought she did. Sure, he was quiet. Sure, he didn't make a fuss. But Jake wasn't weak. He wasn't scared. And he definitely wasn't dumb. While Karen was out there yelling and waving her rule book, Jake was inside, sitting back down with his lemonade. He took a sip, the ice clinking in the glass, and he chuckled to himself. The cops, huh, he said softly, shaking his head. He wasn't worried. Not even a little. Why wasn't he worried? Because Jake had something up his sleeve, something Karen couldn't see coming. It wasn't just that he thought the cops wouldn't care about sunshades, which they probably wouldn't. It was bigger than that. Jake had been watching Karen for a while, not in a creepy way, but in a smart way. He'd noticed things about her house. Weird things. Like how strange cars showed up late at night, parking for just a minute before driving off. Or how packages kept piling up by her door, more than anyone could need. Jake didn't gossip about it, he wasn't that kind of guy, but he'd put two and two together. Something fishy was going on, and he'd already made a quiet call to the police a few days ago. Not 911, just a little tip to the station. "Hey," he'd said, "you might want to check out Karen's place. Something's not right." He didn't know if they'd do anything about it. He didn't expect them to show up right away. But he figured it was worth mentioning, just in case. And now Karen was calling the cops herself, thinking she was about to get Jake in trouble. She had no idea they might already be interested in her. She thought she was the one pulling the strings, but Jake? He was sitting back, sipping his drink, knowing she was about to trip over her own big plan. Outside, Karen was still in Jake's yard, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, hello," she said loudly into the phone. "This is Karen Thompson on Maple Street. I need you to send someone over right now. There's a man here breaking the rules, and he won't listen." She paced back and forth, her voice sharp and bossy. "It's his car, it's got these awful sunshades, and they're ruining everything. You need to come make him stop." She nodded as she talked, like the person on the other end could see her. "Yes, right now. This is an emergency." Inside, Jake heard bits of her call through the window. He couldn't help but laugh a little. An emergency? Over sunshades? It was so silly he almost felt bad for her. Almost. He leaned back in his chair, the lemonade cool in his hand, and waited. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he had a good feeling. Karen thought she was about to teach him a lesson, but she was the one who was in for a surprise. A big one. Karen hung up the phone and smirked, crossing her arms again. "They're coming," she said out loud, even though Jake couldn't hear her. "You'll see, Jake. You can't mess with me." She stood there, proud as can be, thinking she'd won. She pictured the police pulling up, lights flashing, telling Jake to take down those shades. She imagined him looking embarrassed, maybe even saying sorry. Oh, how she'd love that. It'd be her big moment, proof she was the queen of the street. But Karen didn't know the whole story. She didn't know what Jake knew. She thought she was in charge, but the truth was, she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. The cops might come, sure, but they weren't coming for Jake. They were coming for her. And when they did, oh boy, things were going to get wild. Jake wasn't scared of her threats because he didn't need to be. He had the upper hand, and Karen? She was walking right into a trap she didn't even see. A few minutes passed after Karen's big phone call to the cops. The sun was still shining bright over Maple Street, and everything seemed quiet again, at least for a moment. Jake was back on his porch, sitting in his favorite chair with the soft cushion. His lemonade glass was in his hand, the ice cubes clinking softly as they melted. He took a sip, the sweet and sour taste making him smile. He wasn't worried at all. Not one bit. Karen had yelled and threatened to call the police, but Jake just shrugged it off. He figured she was all talk, like a dog that barks but doesn't bite. He leaned back, looked up at the blue sky, and thought, this is still a pretty good day. Across the street, Karen was feeling very different. She was standing on her perfect green lawn, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Her phone was back in her pocket now, and she had a big, smug grin on her face. You know that look someone gets when they think they've won something? That was Karen right then. She was sure the cops were on their way to tell Jake he was in big trouble. She could almost picture it, sirens blaring, lights flashing, officers marching up to Jake's porch and saying, "Take those sunshades down, mister." Oh, how she'd love that. She'd stand there, nodding like she was the smartest person ever, proving she was the boss of Maple Street. That's what she thought was about to happen. Boy, was she wrong. Then, all of a sudden, a sound cut through the air. Woo woo woo. Sirens. They started far away at first, just a little hum, but they got louder and louder fast. Jake heard them too. He sat up a bit in his chair, tilting his head to listen. The noise bounced off the houses, making it hard to tell where it was coming from at first. But then, down at the end of the street, a police car turned the corner. Its red and blue lights were flashing bright, spinning like little fireworks. The sirens kept going woo woo woo, and the car rolled closer and closer to Jake's house. Karen's grin got even bigger. She practically bounced on her toes, her slippers sinking into the grass. "They're here," she said out loud, even though no one was close enough to hear her. "I knew it. They're coming for you, Jake." She uncrossed her arms and clapped her hands together once, like she was celebrating already. She was so sure she'd won. She thought the cops were about to pull right up to Jake's driveway, jump out, and back her up. In her mind, she was the hero of the neighborhood, the one who kept everything perfect. She couldn't wait to see Jake's face when he got in trouble. Oh, this was going to be good. Jake, though. He didn't look scared. Not even a little. He watched the police car come closer, his lemonade still in his hand. He took another sip, slow and calm, like he was watching a boring TV show instead of a cop car rolling up. The sirens were loud now, filling the whole street with noise. A few neighbors peeked out their windows or stepped onto their porches to see what was going on. Mrs. Carter, the old lady with the little dog, stopped walking again and stared. A kid on a bike pedaled over to the curb and stood there, holding his handlebars, his mouth open. Everyone wanted to know what the fuss was about. The police car slowed down as it got near Jake's house. Its tires crunched on the road, and the sirens turned off with one last woo. The lights kept flashing, though red, blue, making little colorful dots bounce off the houses. Two officers stepped out of the car. One was tall with a big hat, and the other was shorter with a clipboard in his hand. They shut the car doors thump, thump, and looked around. Karen didn't waste a second. She practically ran over to them, her arms waving like she was trying to flag down a plane. "Here. Over here," she shouted, her voice loud and sharp. She stopped right in front of the officers, pointing back at Jake's car like it was the most important thing in the world. "That's him," she said, jabbing her finger toward the driveway. "That's the guy breaking the rules. Look at his car, those sunshades are illegal. Arrest him." She was so excited she was almost hopping, her face all red and sweaty from running over. She crossed her arms again and nodded hard, like she'd just solved a big mystery. "He wouldn't listen to me, so I had to call you. You need to do something about this right now." Jake watched all this from his porch. He didn't get up. He didn't run over or yell back. He just sat there, one leg crossed over the other, sipping his lemonade. The ice clinked in his glass again, and he wiped a little drop of water off his hand onto his shorts. He could hear every word Karen was saying. She was loud enough for the whole street to hear, but he didn't look mad or worried. In fact, he almost smiled. Just a tiny little curve at the corner of his mouth. Why? Because Jake knew something Karen didn't. Something big. But he wasn't going to say it yet. He was just going to watch and wait. The officers didn't move toward Jake's car like Karen wanted. They didn't even look at it. Not even a quick peek. Instead, the tall officer turned to Karen and held up one hand, like he was saying hold on. The shorter one with the clipboard flipped a page and started reading something. Karen kept talking, her voice getting faster and louder. "Those shades are an eyesore," she said. "They're against the HOA rules. I told him to take them down, but he wouldn't listen. You have to make him stop." She pointed at Jake again, her arm stretched out so far it looked like it might pop off. But then, the tall officer spoke. His voice was deep and calm, totally different from Karen's yelling. "Ma'am," he said, looking right at her. "We need to talk to you." He didn't shout it, he didn't have to. His words were clear and strong, and they stopped Karen dead in her tracks. Her mouth was open, ready to say more, but no sound came out. Her smug grin, the one she'd had since the sirens started, faded fast. It was like someone had turned off a light switch on her face. Her eyes got wide, and her arms dropped to her sides. "Me," she said, her voice squeaky now. "What do you mean, me?" Jake took another sip of his lemonade, watching it all. That little smile on his face got just a tiny bit bigger. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. He just leaned back in his chair and let things play out. Across the street, Karen blinked at the officers, her head tilting like she didn't understand. "No, no, no," she said, shaking her head fast. "You're here for him. I called you about his car. Those sunshades are the problem." She turned and pointed at Jake again, like maybe the officers had forgotten where he was. The shorter officer with the clipboard looked up from his papers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quieter than the tall one's but just as serious. "This isn't about the car. We're here to talk to you." He tapped his clipboard with his pen, tap, tap, and looked at her over the top of his glasses. Karen's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but nothing came out. She took a step back, her slippers sliding on the grass, and stared at the officers like they'd just grown extra heads. Jake watched it all from his porch, cool as can be. He set his lemonade down on the little table next to him and folded his hands in his lap. He wasn't surprised, not even a little. Why? Because Jake had a secret, and that secret was starting to come out. See, while Karen was busy playing neighborhood detective, snooping around and yelling about sunshades, Jake had been watching her too. Not in a mean way, not in a nosy way, but in a smart way. He'd noticed strange things about her house lately. And those things, they were why the cops were here now. Let's rewind a bit so you can see what Jake saw. A few weeks ago, maybe even a month, Jake started noticing stuff. It wasn't big at first, just little things that seemed odd. Like one night, he was up late watching TV, and he saw a car pull up to Karen's house. It was dark out, way past bedtime for most people, and the car didn't have its lights on. It just rolled up quietly, stopped for a minute, and then drove off. Jake thought it was weird, but he didn't say anything. He figured maybe it was a friend or something. No big deal, right? But then it happened again. And again. Different cars, always late at night, always quick stops. Sometimes Jake would hear a little thump like something being dropped off before the car zoomed away. He started paying attention after that. He'd sit by his window sometimes, not every night, just once in a while, and watch. He saw packages, 2 brown boxes piling up by Karen's front door. Not just 1 or 2, like when you order a new toy or some clothes online. No, this was a lot. Dozens of boxes, stacked up high, more than anyone could use. And here's the funny part, Karen never brought them inside. They'd just sit there for a day or 2, and then they'd be gone. Poof. Like magic. Jake wasn't the type to gossip. He didn't run around telling everyone, "Hey, Karen's up to something." He didn't knock on doors or spread rumors. That wasn't him. But he was curious. And smart. So one day, about a week ago, he decided to do something about it. He didn't call 911 like Karen did, he wasn't dramatic like that. Instead, he picked up his phone and called the police station, real quiet and calm. "Hi," he said when someone answered. "I live on Maple Street, and I've been seeing some weird stuff at my neighbor's house. Strange cars, lots of packages. I don't know what's going on, but maybe you should check it out." He gave them Karen's address, said thanks, and hung up. That was it. No fuss, no big scene. Just a little tip. He didn't know if they'd listen. He didn't expect lights and sirens or anything crazy. He just thought, well, if something's wrong, they'll figure it out. And then he went back to his normal life work, lemonade, waving at neighbors. He didn't tell anyone, not even Mrs. Carter with her little dog. It was his little secret, tucked away like a card up his sleeve. And now that secret was starting to peek out. Back in the street, Karen was still staring at the officers, her face all confused and shaky. "What do you mean, talk to me," she said, her voice getting loud again. "I'm the one who called you. I'm the victim here. He's the one breaking the rules." She pointed at Jake one more time, but her hand was trembling now. The tall officer shook his head. "Ma'am, please calm down," he said. "We've had some reports about your house. We need to ask you a few questions." Karen's eyes got so big they looked like they might pop out. "Reports?" she squeaked. "What reports? Who said anything about me?" She looked around, her head spinning left and right, like she thought someone was hiding in the bushes, tattling on her. The shorter officer stepped closer, holding his clipboard up. "We've been told about some strange activity," he said. "Late night visitors. Packages piling up. Sound familiar?" He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to answer. Jake, still on his porch, couldn't hear every word, but he could see Karen's face. And oh boy, It was a sight. She went from mad to scared in about half a second. Her hands started waving again, but this time it wasn't bossy, it was panicky. "That's ridiculous," she shouted. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a good neighbor. I follow the rules." She kept talking, her words tumbling over each other, but the officers didn't look convinced. The tall one put his hands on his hips, and the shorter one wrote something on his clipboard. Scribble, scribble. The neighbors were watching now too. Mrs. Carter's little dog barked once, and she shushed it. The kid on the bike leaned forward, his eyes wide. A lady down the street opened her window and stuck her head out. Everyone could feel it, something big was happening. Karen thought she'd called the cops to get Jake in trouble, but now they were asking her questions. The tables were turning, and they were turning fast. Jake took one last sip of his lemonade, the glass almost empty now. He set it down and stood up, stretching his arms a little. He wasn't going to say anything, not yet. He didn't need to. The cops were doing the talking, and Karen was doing the squirming. Whatever she'd been up to with those packages and late-night cars, it was catching up with her. And Jake? He was just the guy who'd noticed. The guy who'd made one quiet call. The guy who wasn't scared of her threats, because he knew something she didn't. Karen's voice got louder again. "This is a mistake," she yelled. "You're supposed to be arresting him. Look at his car." But the officers didn't look at Jake's car. They didn't even glance his way. They kept their eyes on Karen, calm and steady, like they'd heard her kind of yelling before. "Ma'am," the tall one said again, "we're not here about sunshades. We're here about you." And with that, the whole street went quiet except for Karen, who was still flapping her arms and talking a mile a minute. The tables weren't just turning, they were flipping right over. And Jake? He was watching it all, cool as a cucumber, knowing this was just the start. The air on Maple Street felt thick and heavy, like something huge was about to happen. The police car sat there in the middle of the road, its red and blue lights still flashing, spinning little dots of color across the houses. The tall officer stood with his hands on his hips, looking at Karen like he was waiting for her to say something smart. The shorter officer held his clipboard tight, flipping a page with a little swish sound. Karen was right in front of them, her arms flapping like a bird that didn't know where to fly. Her face was red just a minute ago, full of anger and bossiness, but now it was turning white, pale as a ghost. She didn't look so smug anymore. Jake was still on his porch, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed. His lemonade glass sat empty on the table next to him, the ice all melted into a tiny puddle. He watched everything happening across the street, and he had to press his lips together to keep from laughing. Not a big loud laugh, just a quiet little chuckle he kept inside. Why? Because this was it, the big moment. Karen thought she was in charge, but oh boy, was she about to find out she wasn't. Jake knew it, and he couldn't wait to see her face when the truth came out. The tall officer took a step closer to Karen. His big boots made a thump on the grass, and he looked down at her with serious eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and slow, "we've had reports of suspicious activity at your address." He paused for a second, letting those words sink in. Karen's eyes got wide, so wide they looked like they might pop right out of her head. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, just a little squeak, like a mouse caught in a trap. The officer didn't stop. He kept going. "Care to explain the packages piling up in your garage?" he asked, raising one eyebrow like he already knew the answer. Karen's face went from white to whiter, if that was even possible. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, or maybe like she was about to turn into one. Her hands dropped to her sides, and she took a shaky step back, her slippers sliding on the grass. "Packages," she stammered, her voice all wobbly. "What packages? I don't know what you're talking about." She shook her head fast, her hair bouncing around her face. "This is outrageous. I called you about him." She spun around and pointed at Jake again, her finger trembling in the air. "He's the one you should be talking to. His sunshades are the problem." Jake didn't move. He just leaned against the railing, cool as can be. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. The officers didn't even look his way. Not a glance, not a peek, nothing. Their eyes stayed locked on Karen, and Jake could tell they weren't buying her story. Not one bit. He shifted his weight a little, resting one elbow on the railing, and watched. This was getting good, really good. Karen thought she'd called the cops to get him in trouble, but now they were asking her questions. And those questions, they were about to flip her whole world upside down. The shorter officer with the clipboard stepped forward now. He tapped his pen on the papers, tap, 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 and looked at Karen over the top of his glasses. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quieter but just as firm, "we've been watching your house for weeks." He let that hang in the air for a second, watching her face. Karen's jaw dropped, and she made a little choking sound, like she couldn't breathe right. "Weeks," she squeaked, her hands flying up to her cheeks. "Watching me? Why? I'm a good neighbor. I don't do anything wrong." The tall officer nodded, like he'd heard that excuse before. "We got a tip," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "Someone told us about strange things happening at your place. Cars showing up late at night. Packages stacking up in your garage more than anyone needs. Sound familiar?" He tilted his head, waiting for her to answer. The shorter officer flipped another page on his clipboard and wrote something down. Scribble, scribble, his pen moving fast across the paper. Karen's hands dropped from her cheeks, and she started waving them again, but this time it wasn't bossy, it was panicky. "A tip," she shouted, her voice so loud it echoed down the street. Who told you that?" "That's a lie. I don't have packages. I don't have cars. This is crazy." She spun around, looking at the neighbors who were watching now. Mrs. Carter with her dog, the kid on the bike, the lady at her window. "Tell them," she yelled at them. "Tell them I'm a good person. I keep the street perfect." But nobody said anything. They just stared, their eyes big and curious. Jake, still on his porch, couldn't hold back that little chuckle anymore. It slipped out just a quiet "ha," and he covered his mouth with his hand to hide it. He didn't want Karen to hear him laughing, but oh man, this was funny. Turns out, Karen wasn't just a rule-obsessed nag who loved bossing everyone around. Nope. She'd been up to something else, something sneaky, something shady. And Jake? He was the one who'd figured it out. He was the one who'd tipped off the cops. And now, right here in front of everyone, her big secret was coming out. Let's back up a bit so you can see how it all came together. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who snooped just to be nosy. He didn't peek through windows or listen at doors like some people might. But he was smart, and he paid attention. A few weeks ago, he started noticing weird stuff at Karen's house. It wasn't one big thing that made him suspicious, it was lots of little things adding up. Like one night, he was up late, maybe watching a movie or eating a snack, and he saw a car pull up to Karen's place. It was dark outside, way past when most people were awake, and the car didn't turn its lights on. It just rolled up quiet as a mouse, stopped for a minute, and then drove off. Jake thought, that's odd, but he didn't make a fuss about it. He went back to his movie and forgot it. But then it kept happening. Another night, another car. Then another. Always late, always quiet, always quick. Jake started watching a little more after that, not every night, just sometimes. He'd sit by his window with a glass of water or a bowl of popcorn, keeping one eye on the TV and one eye on the street. He saw packages, 2 big brown boxes piling up by Karen's front door. Not just a couple, like when you order a new game or some socks. No, this was a lot, 10, 15, 20 boxes sometimes, stacked up high like a little wall. And the weirdest part? Karen didn't bring them in right away. They'd sit there for a day or two, and then poof, they'd be gone. No moving truck, no delivery guy picking them up. Just gone. Jake started wondering what was up. He didn't think Karen was just buying a ton of stuff for herself. She didn't seem like the type to order 20 boxes of shoes or whatever. And those late-night cars? They didn't look like friends stopping by for a chat. Something felt off. So one day, about a week ago, he decided to do something. He didn't tell the neighbors or spread rumors, that wasn't his style. Instead, he picked up his phone and called the police station. Not 911, just the regular number. "Hi," he said when someone answered. "I live on Maple Street, and I've seen some funny stuff at my neighbor's house. Cars at night, lots of packages. I don't know what's going on, but maybe you should check it out." He gave them Karen's address, said thanks, and hung up. Simple as that. He didn't know if they'd take it seriously. He didn't expect them to show up with sirens or anything wild. He just figured it was worth a call, just in case. And then he went back to his normal life work, lemonade, sitting on his porch. He didn't tell anyone, not even his best buddy down the street. It was his little secret, and he kept it quiet. Until now. Now that secret was coming out, and it was hitting Karen like a big, fat surprise. Back in the street, Karen was still freaking out. "This is outrageous," she yelled again, her voice cracking. "I called you. I told you about him." She pointed at Jake one more time, but her arm was shaking so bad it looked like it might fall off. "Those sunshades are illegal. That's why you're here. Tell him to take them down." She stomped her foot on the grass, her slipper making a little squelch sound. She was trying so hard to turn it back on Jake, to make it his fault again. But the cops? They weren't listening to that. The tall officer shook his head. "Ma'am," he said, "we're not here about sunshades." He took a step closer, and Karen took a step back, her eyes darting around like she was looking for a place to run. "We've been watching your house," he went on. "Those packages. Those late-night cars. We've got reports. And your call today? It just gave us a reason to come check things out without you knowing ahead of time." He paused, letting that sink in. The shorter officer nodded and added, "Your neighbor's tip was the last piece we needed." Karen's head snapped up. "Neighbor," she squeaked. "What neighbor?" She looked around again, her eyes landing on Jake. He was still on his porch, leaning against the railing, looking calm and quiet. Karen's face twisted up, and she pointed at him. "Him," she shouted. "Jake? He did this? He's lying. He's just mad because I told him his sunshades are ugly." She was yelling so loud now that her voice was hoarse, like she'd been screaming all day. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood there, watching her fall apart. The officers didn't look at him either, they kept their eyes on Karen. The tall one pulled a little notebook out of his pocket and flipped it open. "We've got dates," he said. "Times. Descriptions of cars. Pictures of packages. We've been building a case for weeks." He looked up at her. "Want to tell us what's in those boxes, ma'am? Or should we go look ourselves?" Karen's knees wobbled, and she grabbed the edge of her mailbox to steady herself. "This is a mistake," she said, but her voice was weaker now, like she wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know anything about boxes. I'm innocent." She kept talking, her words tumbling over each other, but the officers weren't buying it. The shorter one put his clipboard under his arm and pulled out a radio. "Unit 12, he said into it, "we're gonna need backup at 24 Maple Street. Possible search required." The radio crackled back with a copy that, and Karen's face went even paler. Jake finally let out a little laugh. He couldn't hold it in anymore. It wasn't loud, just a soft ha, that he covered with his hand. He leaned forward on the railing, resting his chin on his fist, and watched. Turns out, Karen wasn't just a nag who loved rules. She'd been running a little side hustle, something sneaky and shady enough to get the police knocking. What was it? Jake didn't know for sure. Maybe she was selling stuff she shouldn't, or hiding things for someone else. Whatever it was big enough to bring the cops to her door. And Jake's tip? That was the final piece they needed to catch her. Those sunshades Karen hated so much. They were just an excuse. When she called 911, all worked up about Jake's car, she gave the cops a perfect reason to show up without tipping her off. They'd been waiting for a chance to check her out, and she handed it to them on a silver platter. Boom. Karen's whole world crashed down, right there in the middle of the street, in front of all the neighbors she loved to boss around. Mrs. Carter's dog barked again, the kid on the bike gasped, and the lady at the window leaned out farther. Everyone saw it, Karen's big moment, turning into her big fall. Karen kept talking, her voice high and fast. "You can't do this," she yelled. "I'm a good person. I follow the rules. He's the one you should arrest." She pointed at Jake again, but nobody cared. The officers stepped closer, and she stepped back, her slippers catching on the grass. "We'll see about that," the tall one said, his voice firm. "Let's take a look in that garage." He nodded at the shorter officer, who started walking toward Karen's house. Karen's eyes went wild. No, she shouted, running after him. You can't go in there. You need a what's it called, a warrant. You don't have one. She grabbed at his arm, but he shook her off gently. Ma'am, he said, calm down. We've got enough to take a look. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about. But Karen's face said she had plenty to worry about. She spun around, looking at Jake, at the neighbors, at the cops, like she didn't know what to do. Jake stayed where he was, watching it all. He didn't cheer or clap or say I told you so. That wasn't him. He just stood there, quiet and calm, as Karen's perfect little world fell apart. She thought she was the queen of Maple Street, but now she was just a lady in slippers, yelling in the street while the cops closed in. Her big plan to get Jake in trouble had backfired big time. And it was all because of him, the quiet guy with the sunshades, who'd seen more than she ever guessed. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky over Maple Street, turning the clouds pink and orange. The police cars' lights were still flashing red, blue, bouncing off the houses like a little light show. The tall officer and the shorter one with the clipboard were busy now, moving fast. Karen's perfect little house didn't look so perfect anymore. Her garage door was wide open, and inside, you could see stacks of brown boxes, tons of them piled up high like a messy tower. The cops had pulled out some yellow tape, the kind you see in movies, and they stretched it across the garage with big letters that said police line, do not cross. It flapped a little in the breeze, making a soft whoosh sound. Karen wasn't yelling about Jake's sunshades anymore. Oh no. She had bigger problems now, way bigger. The officers had found something in those boxes, something she didn't want anyone to see. What was it? Jake didn't know for sure, and neither did the neighbors, but it was bad enough that the cops had called for more help. Another police car rolled up, its sirens quiet this time, and two more officers jumped out. They carried big bags and started talking to the first two, pointing at the garage and nodding. Karen stood in the middle of it all, her hands behind her back, and click, she was in handcuffs. Yep, real metal handcuffs, shiny and cold, locked around her wrists. She didn't go quietly, though. Oh no, Karen wasn't done yet. As the tall officer led her toward the police car, she twisted around and shouted, "This is wrong. I didn't do anything. It's all about the HOA rules." Her voice was loud and squeaky, like a toy that wouldn't stop making noise. "You can't do this to me. I'm the one who keeps the street perfect." She pulled against the cuffs, her slippers sliding on the grass, but the officer just kept walking, holding her arm gently but firmly. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to calm down. You're coming with us." And with that, he opened the car door creak and helped her inside. The neighbors were everywhere now. They'd come out of their houses, off their porches, and into the street to watch. Mrs. Carter stood on the sidewalk, her little dog Tinker barking at the commotion. The kid on the bike pedaled closer, his eyes big as saucers. A lady down the street held her phone up, maybe taking a picture or a video. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who almost never left his house, peeked out his window, his gray hair sticking up like he'd just woken up. They were all whispering to each other, their voices low and buzzy like bees. "What's going on?" someone said. "Did Karen do something bad?" another asked. "I knew she was up to no good," Mrs. Carter muttered, shushing Tinker again. Jake. He was still on his porch, cool as can be. He leaned against the railing, watching it all like it was a show on TV. His lemonade glass was empty now, just a few drops left in the bottom, and he set it down on the little table next to his chair. The cops were busy with Karen, taping off her garage and talking into their radios. Crackle, crackle, but Jake didn't move. He didn't cheer or jump up and down. He didn't need to. He just gave a little wave to the tall officer, a quick lift of his hand, and the officer nodded back. Then Jake turned around, walked inside his house, and grabbed another glass of lemonade from the kitchen. He wasn't worried, not one bit. His car was still parked right where it had been all day, sitting in the driveway with those shiny sunshades in the windows. They glinted a little in the fading sunlight, silver and bright, doing their job of keeping the heat out. Karen had hated them, called them an eyesore, yelled about them breaking her rules, but now nobody cared. Nobody said a word about them anymore. The neighbors who'd heard her shouting earlier just looked at Jake's car, then at Karen in the police car, and shrugged. Those sunshades weren't the problem. Karen was. By the time the sun was almost gone, the cops were wrapping things up. The garage was all taped off, yellow lines crisscrossing the front like a big warning sign. The extra officers had gone inside Karen's house, coming out with more boxes, some big, some small, and loading them into the back of a police van that had just pulled up. Thump, thump went the boxes as they stacked them inside. Karen sat in the first police car, her face pressed against the window, still talking even though no one could hear her now. Her hair was messy, her slippers were dirty from all the running around, and she didn't look like the neighborhood queen anymore. She looked small, scared, and mad all at once. The tall officer shut the car door thump and nodded to the driver. "Take her in," he said, and the car started up with a low rumble. The lights flashed one more time, red, blue, and then it rolled down the street, slow and steady, taking Karen away. She twisted in the back seat, trying to look out the window, but the car kept going until it turned the corner and disappeared. The neighbors watched it go, their whispers getting louder now. "She's really gone," the kid on the bike said, his voice full of wonder. "Good riddance," Mrs. Carter mumbled, picking up Tinker and heading back to her house. Jake came back outside with his fresh lemonade, the ice clinking in the glass. He plopped down in his chair again, stretching his legs out, and took a big sip. The street was quieter now, with the sirens gone and the police cars leaving one by one. The van with the boxes drove off next, its engine humming as it followed the first car. The tall officer and the shorter one stayed a little longer, talking to each other and writing stuff down. Scribble, scribble on that clipboard. Then they got in their car, waved at Jake one last time, and drove away too. The lights stopped flashing, the noise faded, and Maple Street went back to being peaceful just like it had been before Karen's big scene. Jake looked at his car, still sitting there with its sunshades up. He smiled a little, a quiet smile that nobody saw. Nobody dared complain about those shades now, not after all this. The neighbors who'd been watching went back to their houses, closing their doors and turning on their lights as the sky got dark. The kid on the bike pedaled home, calling out, "See ya," to no one in particular. Mrs. Carter's dog barked one last time, and then it was just Jake, his lemonade, and the night settling in. The next day, things felt different on Maple Street. The sun came up like always, bright and warm, and people went about their morning stuff, walking dogs, getting mail, watering flowers. But there was no Karen marching around with her rule book, no loud voice telling everyone what to do. Her house sat quiet, the yellow tape still stretched across the garage. A few neighbors stopped to look at it, shaking their heads and whispering again. "What do you think she did?" one asked. "Something sneaky," another said. Nobody knew for sure yet, but they all agreed on one thing: Karen wasn't the boss anymore. A week later, a little paper showed up in everyone's mailbox. It was from the HOA, the Homeowners Association, that group Karen loved so much. Jake got one too. He sat on his porch, sipping his lemonade like always, and opened it up. It was short, just a few lines typed in black ink. "Notice to residents," it said at the top. "After recent events, the HOA has reviewed its rules. The rule about sunshades in car windows is no longer in effect. Thank you for your understanding." That was it. No big explanation, no sorry, nothing fancy. Just a quiet little note saying the no sunshade rule was gone. Jake chuckled when he read it. "Funny how that works, right?" he said to himself, folding the paper and setting it on the table. He leaned back in his chair and took another sip of lemonade, the ice cold against his lips. Karen had made such a fuss about those sunshades, yelling and calling the cops, thinking she could control everyone. But in the end, she was the one breaking the biggest rules of all rules, way worse than anything about a car window. Whatever she'd been doing with those packages and late-night cars, it was bad enough to get her hauled away in handcuffs. And now the HOA didn't care about sunshades anymore. Funny, huh? Word got around fast after that. People started talking about what happened, not just whispers anymore, but real stories. Mrs. Carter told everyone at the grocery store that she'd always thought Karen was too bossy. The kid on the bike told his friends at school that he saw her get arrested, making it sound like a big adventure. Old Mr. Jenkins even came out of his house one day and said, "Good for Jake," before shuffling back inside. Nobody knew exactly what Karen had done yet, the cops were still figuring it out, but they all knew it was something sneaky. Maybe she was selling stuff she shouldn't, or hiding things for someone else. Whatever it was, It was over now. Jake didn't brag about it. He didn't run around saying, "I told you so," or "I'm the hero." That wasn't him. He just kept doing his thing, waving at neighbors, sipping lemonade, keeping his car in the driveway with those sunshades up. But something changed anyway. People looked at him differently now. Not in a big, loud way, but in a quiet, respectful way. They'd smile when they passed his house, or nod like they were saying, "Hey, good job." Nobody messed with him anymore, not about his car, not about anything. Jake had always been the nice guy, the quiet guy, but now he was the guy who'd stood up to Karen without even raising his voice. The guy who'd won without making a fuss. One morning, a few days after the HOA note, Mrs. Carter walked by with Tinker. She stopped at the edge of Jake's yard and waved. "Morning, Jake," she called, her voice cheerful. "Nice day, huh?" Jake waved back from his porch. "Sure is," he said, holding up his lemonade glass. "Want some?" She laughed and shook her head. "No thanks, but you keep those sunshades up, okay? They look just fine to me." She winked, like they were sharing a little secret, and kept walking. Tinker barked once, and they were gone. Later that week, the kid on the bike rode by and slowed down. "Hey, Jake," he yelled, grinning big. "You're cool. Karen's gone, and your car's awesome." Jake chuckled and waved. "Thanks, buddy," he called back. The kid pedaled off, laughing like it was the best day ever. Even the lady down the street, the one who'd taken pictures, stopped by one afternoon. She brought Jake a plate of cookies, chocolate chip, still warm from the oven. "Thanks for keeping an eye out," she said quietly, handing him the plate. "We all feel safer now." Jake took the cookies and smiled. "No problem," he said. "Just doing what's right." That's how it went. Little by little, day by day, Maple Street settled back into its old self, but better. No more Karen stomping around, waving her rulebook and yelling at everyone. No more complaints about silly things like sunshades or long grass or loud dogs. People started relaxing more, smiling more, talking to each other like friends instead of scared neighbors. And Jake? He stayed the same, quiet, nice, sipping his lemonade on his porch. But everyone knew he was the one who'd changed things. He didn't need to say it. They just knew. Karen's house stayed empty after that. The yellow tape came down eventually, but nobody moved in. Maybe it was for sale, or maybe the cops were still checking it out. Either way, it sat there, quiet and still, with no more packages or late-night cars. The neighbors didn't miss her, not really. They missed the drama a little, maybe, because it gave them something to talk about, but they didn't miss her bossing them around. "Good riddance," Mrs. Carter said every time it came up, and most people nodded. Jake kept his car in the driveway, sunshades and all. Nobody ever said a word about them again, not a peep. One day, he even added a little flag to his porch, a small one with a smiley face on it, just for fun. It waved in the breeze while he sat there with his lemonade, watching the world go by. The street was peaceful now, the way he'd always liked it. And if anyone thought about complaining, they'd look at Jake, remember what happened to Karen, and keep their mouths shut. He wasn't loud or mean, but he was the guy nobody messed with anymore. By the end of the month, the whole thing felt like a story people told, a wild tale about the day Karen got caught. Kids made it a game, riding their bikes past her house and pretending to be cops. "Freeze," they'd yell, laughing and zooming off. Adults swapped theories over coffee or at the mailbox. Maybe she was a spy, or maybe she was selling stolen stuff. Nobody knew for sure, but they all agreed on one thing: Jake had saved the day, quiet as can be. He didn't need sirens or handcuffs or a big speech. He just needed a phone call, a little tip, and those sunshades Karen hated so much. So that's how it ended. Karen's garage got taped off, she got hauled away in handcuffs, and Maple Street got its peace back. Jake stayed nice, calm, sipping his lemonade like nothing had happened. His car stayed where it was, sunshades shining in the sun, and nobody dared complain again. The HOA dropped the rule, Karen's control was gone, and Jake became the guy everyone respected. Funny how it all worked out, right? One little fight over sunshades turned into justice for the whole street. And that's the way it stayed, quiet, happy, and fair, just like Jake always wanted. Okay, friends, Let's sit down together for a minute and talk about what just happened on Maple Street. Grab a snack, maybe some juice or a cookie, and picture this: Jake still on his porch, sipping that cold lemonade, his sunshades shining in the car window. Karen's gone, hauled off in that police car with her slippers and her yelling, and the neighborhood's quiet again better than ever. It's a wild story, right? But there's more to it than just a nosy lady and a cool guy with a smart plan. There's something big we can learn from all this, something that makes you think. So here's the thing: sometimes the loudest people are hiding the most. Let's figure out what that means together. Think about Karen for a second. She was loud, super loud. She marched around Maple Street like she owned it, telling everyone what to do. Cut your grass, she'd yell. Move that bike, she'd snap. Take down those sunshades, she barked at Jake. Her voice was big, her rulebook was always in her hand, and she acted like she was the queen of everything. If you heard her shouting, you'd think she had it all figured out, like she was perfect and everyone else was wrong. She pointed fingers at Jake, called the cops on him, and made a huge fuss about something as little as sunshades. She wanted everyone to think she was the boss, the one in charge, the one who never made mistakes. But here's the twist: Karen wasn't perfect. Not even close. While she was busy yelling at Jake and waving her rulebook, she was hiding something sneaky. Those packages piling up in her garage? Those late-night cars? They weren't just nothing. They were part of something shady, something she didn't want anyone to know about. She thought she could scare Jake into line, make him take down those sunshades and follow her rules. She thought she was so smart, pointing at him like he was the bad guy. But she never saw the real story coming. She didn't know Jake was watching, noticing, and figuring things out. She didn't know her loud voice and big attitude were hiding a secret that was about to spill out for everyone to see. And Jake? He was the opposite. He wasn't loud. He didn't stomp around or yell at people. He didn't wave a rulebook or call anyone names. He was quiet, sipping his lemonade, waving at neighbors, keeping his car in the driveway with those shiny sunshades. If you looked at him, you might think, oh, he's just a regular guy. Nothing special. Karen sure thought that. She judged him by those sunshades, decided they were ugly, and figured he was just some guy she could boss around. But Jake had something up his sleeve, something big. He wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. He was smart, and he was brave in his own quiet way. He saw what Karen was hiding, made one little phone call, and boom, her whole world flipped upside down. So what's the lesson here? It's simple, friends: don't judge someone by what you see on the outside, because you never know what they've got inside. Karen looked at Jake's sunshades and thought she knew everything about him. She thought he was breaking rules, making a mess, being a problem. But she didn't know the real Jake, the guy who paid attention, the guy who cared about his neighborhood, the guy who wasn't afraid to do the right thing even if it meant standing up to her. Those sunshades? They were just a little thing, a way to keep his car cool. But they ended up being the spark that showed everyone who Karen really was. Think about that for a minute. Have you ever met someone loud like Karen? Someone who talks big, acts bossy, and tries to tell everyone what to do? Maybe at school, there's a kid who's always shouting, "My way's the best." Or maybe in your family, there's someone who thinks they're in charge of everything. Those loud people can seem like they've got it all together, like they're the strongest or the smartest. But sometimes, just sometimes, they're hiding something. Maybe they're scared, or maybe they're doing something they shouldn't, and all that noise is just a way to cover it up. Karen was like that. Her yelling was loud, but her secrets were louder once they got out. And then there's Jake. Quiet Jake. He didn't need to shout or make a big show. He didn't need everyone looking at him or clapping for him. He just did what he thought was right, watched, waited, and made that one little call. He didn't judge Karen by how loud she was or how bossy she acted. He looked closer, saw something funny going on, and decided to help. That's what made him special. Not the sunshades, not the lemonade, but the way he stayed calm and smart when things got wild. He didn't let Karen scare him into line. He stood his ground, quiet as can be, and let the truth come out all by itself. So here's a question for you, friends: have you ever had a moment like that? A time when someone loud, a bully, maybe tried to push you around, but you came out on top. Maybe it was at school, on the playground, when a kid said you couldn't play because you weren't cool enough. Or maybe it was at home, when someone told you your idea was silly, but you showed them it worked. Did you ever see a bully get what was coming to them, just like Karen did? I bet you have a story, big or small, where the loud one didn't win, and the quiet one did. Think about it for a second. Picture that moment in your head. How did it feel? Pretty good, right? Let me tell you a little pretend story to help you think. Imagine a girl named Mia. She's quiet, like Jake. She likes drawing pictures in her notebook during recess, sitting under a tree all by herself. There's this other kid, Tommy, who's loud, really loud. He runs around the playground, telling everyone what games to play. "You can't draw, Mia," he yells one day. "That's boring. Play tag with us or you're out." He points and laughs, and some kids laugh too. Mia feels small, but she doesn't yell back. She just keeps drawing, her pencil moving slow and steady across the page. Then one day, the teacher says, "We need a poster for the school fair. Who can draw it?" Tommy jumps up, shouting, "I'm the best. I'll do it." But when he tries, his drawing's all messy scribbles and smudges. Mia quietly hands in her picture, a big, bright poster with balloons and smiles. The teacher picks hers, and it goes up on the wall for everyone to see. Tommy's mad, stomping his feet, but nobody listens to him anymore. Mia didn't shout or fight. She just did her thing, and the loud kid didn't win. Sound familiar? That's like Jake and Karen, right? That's the cool thing about this story, friends. It shows us that you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to yell or boss people around to matter. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who watch, think, and do what's right, are the ones who change everything. Karen thought she could control everyone with her big voice and her rules, but she didn't see Jake coming. She didn't see that he had more power in his quiet little tip to the cops than she had in all her shouting. And when her secrets came out, boom, it was over for her. Justice showed up, calm and steady, just like Jake. So what can we take from this? A couple of things, I think. First, don't let the loud people scare you. They might sound big, but that doesn't mean they're right. If someone's yelling at you, telling you you're wrong or silly, take a deep breath and think about Jake. He didn't let Karen's noise shake him. He stayed cool, sipped his lemonade, and let the truth do the talking. You can do that too. If a bully's loud, you don't have to be louder. You just have to be smart and wait for the right moment. Second, don't judge people too fast. Karen looked at Jake's sunshades and decided he was a rule breaker, a troublemaker, someone she could push around. But she didn't know the real him. She didn't know he was watching her, figuring things out, ready to stand up for what's fair. You never know what someone's got up their sleeve, what they're good at, what they're hiding, what they can do. Maybe that quiet kid in class is a super artist like Mia, or maybe they're brave like Jake. Give them a chance, and you might be surprised. And last, be brave in your own way. Jake didn't fight Karen with fists or loud words. He didn't need to. He was brave by being himself, watching, thinking, making that call. You don't have to be loud to be a hero. You can be brave by helping a friend, telling the truth, or just keeping your cool when things get tough. That's what Jake did, and look what happened. The bully lost, the street won, and everything got better. So, friends, what do you think? Have you ever had a moment where the loud one, the bully, got what was coming to them? Maybe it was a time you stood up, or maybe you watched someone else do it. I'd love to hear your stories. Tell me about it, write it down, draw it, or just think about it in your head. Was it at school? At home? On your street? Did the quiet one win, like Jake? I bet you've got something awesome to share, because everyone's got a little Jake in them somewhere. This story's over now, but it's not really gone. It's like a little light you can carry with you. Next time you see someone loud like Karen, remember she might be hiding something. And next time you feel small, like Jake with his sunshades, remember you've got power too. Quiet power, smart power, brave power. You never know when your moment will come, when you'll flip the tables and make things right. So keep your eyes open, your heart strong, and maybe a glass of lemonade handy. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones who change the world.